Last week, we left the story halfway through chapter 46 of Nicholas Nickleby. If you remember, Nicholas had decided to explain to one of his employers, Mr. Charles Cheeryble, why he had refused to give up Smike to be sent back to Dotheboys Hall and the machinations of the odious Mr. Squeers, in spite of the fact that the law appeared to give Squeers the upper hand. Much to Nicola's surprise, Brother Charles knew about it already and heartily approved of what Nicholas had done. Meanwhile, Nicholas' Uncle Ralph had done his best to blacken Nicholas' name, but Brother Charles wouldn't hear a word against him, and had sent Ralph packing with some home truths of his own. Indeed, he'd met with the man who claimed to be Smike's father, Mr. Snawley, and he told him in no uncertain terms what he thought of him. However, this was not the point at issue. Brother Charles and Brother Ned had a plan which involved Nicholas intimately. A little while before, Nicholas had seen something he was not supposed to see. He'd seen a beautiful young lady fainting at the feet of Brother Charles, and he had fallen instantly in love with her. At first, no one would tell him who she was, so he had to possess himself in patience. But now, he was to find out everything. Years before, Brother Charles had been in love with this young lady's mother. But for reasons of her own, she'd married someone else. And Brother Charles had not been merely disappointed, but fearful of what might happen to her, because he knew that the man she had married, although he'd been one of a well-born group of young men who were much admired in society, was in fact a wastrel and a spendthrift. He knew that this man would lead her into debt and treat her cruelly. The young lady whom Nicholas had seen fainting at his employer's feet was her daughter. Now, the mother had died and made her daughter promise to look after her father, who was now a sick man, but still as profligate and cruel as he had ever been. He had reduced himself and his daughter to poverty and forced her to use every moment and all her strength to gain money to support him. She produced drawings and paintings to sell, the profit from which he insisted should be spent exclusively on his welfare. But the money was not enough. The young lady was at her wit's end, and so she'd turned for help to the Cheeryble brothers, and although they knew that every penny would either be spent on her father or wasted by his extravagance, they were determined to help her. They proposed that, unbeknown to her, they would buy her drawings, paying whatever she asked. They hoped she would think that they themselves would go on to sell them to other people and thus ready money. It was vital that whoever that was should not be known to the young lady and her father. They decided that neither Tim Linkinwater nor their nephew Frank would be suitable. Tim would be sure to make known his feelings of disgust at the father's selfish behaviour, and Frank was sure to fall head over heels in love with the young lady herself. And this is where we take up the story and carry on reading the second part of chapter 46. All this time there hovered upon the tip of Nicholas' tongue a confession that the very same objections which made Mr. Cheeryble unsure about the employment of his nephew in this commission applied with equal force and validity to himself. And 100 times he had been upon the point of avowing the real state of his feelings and entreating to be released from it. But as often, treading upon the heels of this impulse, came another which urged him to refrain and to keep his secret to his own breast. Why should I, thought Nicholas, why should I throw difficulties in the way of this benevolent and high-minded design? What if I do love and reverence this good and lovely creature? Should I not appear a most arrogant and shallow coxcomb if I gravely represented that there was any danger of her falling in love with me? Besides, have I no confidence in myself? Am I not bound in honour to repress these thoughts? Has not this excellent man a right to my best and heartiest services? And should any considerations of self deter me from rendering them? Asking himself such questions as these, Nicholas mentally answered with great emphasis, no. And persuading himself that he was a most conscientious and glorious martyr, nobly resolved to do what, if he had examined his own heart a little more carefully, he would have found he could not resist. Such is the sleight of hand by which we juggle with ourselves and change our very weaknesses into the most magnanimous virtues. Mr. Cheeryble, being of course wholly unsuspicious that such reflections were presenting themselves in his young friend's mind, proceeded to give him the needful credentials and directions for his first visit, which was to be made next morning. All preliminaries being arranged and the strictest secrecy enjoined, Nicholas walked home for the night very thoughtfully indeed. The place to which Mr. Cheeryble had directed him was a row of mean and not over-cleanly houses, situated within the rules of the King's Bench prison. In those days, debtors were sent to prison until they had enough money to pay their debts. It was not many hundred paces distant from the obelisk in St. George's Fields. The rules are a certain liberty adjoining the prison and comprising some dozen streets in which the debtors who can raise money to pay large fees from which their creditors do not derive any benefit at all are permitted to reside. To the row of houses indicated to him by Mr. Charles Cheeryble, Nicholas directed his steps. After traversing a very dirty and dusty suburb of which minor theatricals, shellfish, ginger beer, spring cans, greengrocery and brokers' shops appeared to compose the main and most prominent features, he at length arrived with a palpitating heart. There were small gardens in front which, being wholly neglected in all other respects, served as little pens for the dust to collect in until the wind came round the corner and blew it down the road. Opening the rickety gate which, dangling on its broken hinges before one of these, half admitted and half repulsed the visitor, Nicholas knocked at the street door with a faltering hand. It was in truth a shabby house outside, with very dim parlour windows, very small show of blinds, very dirty muslin curtains hanging across the lower panes on a very loose limp string. Neither, when the door was opened, did the inside appear to belie the outward promise, as it was faded with carpeting on the stairs and faded oilcloth in the passage, in addition to which discomforts a gentleman ruler, an official of the prison, was smoking hard in the front parlour, though it was not yet noon, while the lady of the house was busily engaged in turpentining the disjointed fragments of a tent bedstead at the door of the back parlour, as if in preparation for the reception of some new lodger who had been fortunate enough to engage it. Nicholas had ample time to make these observations while the little boy, who went on errands for the lodgers, clattered down the kitchen stairs and was heard to scream as in some remote cellar for Miss Bray's servant, who presently appeared and, requesting him to follow her, caused him to evince greater symptoms of nervousness and disorder than so natural a consequence of his having inquired for that young lady would seem calculated to occasion. Upstairs he went, however, and in a front room he was shown. There, seated at a little table by the window, on which were drawing materials with which she was occupied, sat the beautiful girl who had so engrossed his thoughts, and who, surrounded by all the new and strong interest which Nicholas attached to her story, seemed now in his eyes 1,000 times more beautiful than when first he set his eyes upon her. But how the graces and elegancies which had dispersed about the poorly furnished room went to the heart of Nicholas. He felt as though the smile of heaven were on that little chamber, as though the beautiful devotion of so young and weak a creature had shed a ray of its own on the inanimate things around and made them beautiful as itself, as though the halo with which old painters surround the bright angels of a sinless world played about a being akin in spirit to them, and its light were visibly before him. And yet Nicholas was in the rules of the King's Bench prison. If he had been in Italy indeed, and the time had been sunset and the scene a stately terrace, but there is one broad sky over all the world, and whether it be blue or cloudy, the same heaven beyond it. So perhaps he had no need of compunction for thinking as he did. It is not to be supposed that he took in everything at one glance, for he had been as yet unconscious of the presence of a sick man propped up with pillows in an easy chair, who, moving restlessly and impatiently in his seat, attracted his attention. He was scarce 50, perhaps, but so emaciated as to appear much older. His features presented the remains of a handsome countenance, but one in which the embers of strong and impetuous passions were easier traced than any expression which would have rendered a far plainer face much more prepossessing. His looks were very haggard, and his limbs and body literally worn to the bone, but there was something of the old fire in the large, sunken eye notwithstanding, and it seemed to kindle afresh, as if he struck her with a thick stick. He supported himself with this stick and impatiently banged the floor twice or thrice and called his daughter by her name. "Madeleine, who is this? What does anybody want here? Who told a stranger we could be seen? What is it?" "I believe," the young lady began, as she inclined her head with an air of some confusion in reply to the salutation of Nicholas. "Oh, you always believe," returned her father petulantly. "What is it?" By this time Nicholas had recovered sufficient presence of mind to speak for himself, so he said, as it had been agreed he should say, that he had called about a pair of hand screens and some painted velvet for an ottoman, both of which were required to be of the most elegant and delicate design possible, neither time nor expense being of the smallest consideration. He had also to pay for the 2 drawings. With many thanks, and advancing to the little table, he laid upon it a banknote, folded it in an envelope, and sealed it.
"See the money is right, Madeline," said her father. "Open the paper."
It is quite right, Papa, I'm sure.
Here,
said Mr. Bray, putting his hand open and opening and shutting his bony fingers with irritable impatience.
"Let me see. What are you talking about? Are you sure? How can you be sure of any such thing? £5. Well, is that right?"
"Quite," said Madeline, bending over him. She was so busily employed in arranging the pillows that Nicholas couldn't see her face, but as she stooped he thought he saw a tear fall.
"Ring the bell, ring the bell, ring the bell,"
said the sick man with the same nervous eagerness, and motioning towards it with such a quivering hand that the banknote rustled in the air.
"Tell her to get it changed. Get me a newspaper, buy me some grapes, and another bottle of that wine that I had last week. And I forget half of what I want just now. But she can go out again. Let her go out first and get these things first. Now, Madeline, my love, quick, quick! Good God, how slow you are!"
He remembers nothing that she wants, thought Nicholas. Perhaps something of what he thought was expressed in his countenance, for the sick man, turning towards him with great asperity, demanded to know if he waited for a receipt. "It is no matter at all," said Nicholas.
"No matter? What do you mean, sir?" was the tart rejoinder. "No matter? Do you think you bring your paltry money here as a favour or a gift, or as a matter of business and in return for the value received? Damn you, sir, because you can't appreciate the time and taste which are bestowed upon the goods you deal in, do you think you can give your money away? Do you know that you're talking to a gentleman, sir, who at one time could have bought up 50 such men as you and all you have? What do you mean?"
"I mean simply that as I shall have many dealings with this lady, if she will kindly allow me, I would not trouble her with such forms," said Nicholas.
"Then I mean, if you please, that we'll have as many forms as we can," returned the father. "My daughter, sir, requires no kindness from you or anyone else. Have the goodness to confine your dealings strictly to trade and business, and not travel beyond it. Every petty tradesman is going to begin to pity her, is he now? Upon my soul, very pretty. Madeline, my dear, give him a receipt, and mind you always do."
While she was feigning to write it, Nicholas was ruminating upon the extraordinary but by no means uncommon character thus presented to his observation. The invalid, who appeared at times to suffer great bodily pain, sank back in his chair and moaned out of feeble complaint that the girl had been gone an hour, and that everybody conspired to goad him. "When," asked Nicholas as he took the piece of paper, "when shall I call again?" This was addressed to his daughter, but the father answered immediately.
"When you're requested to call, sir, and not before. Don't worry and persecute. Madeline, my dear, when is this person to call again?"
"Oh, not for a long time, not for 3 or 4 weeks. It isn't necessary, indeed. I can do without it," said the young lady with great eagerness.
"Why, how are we to do without?" urged her father, not speaking above his normal tone. 3 or 4 weeks, Madeline, 3 or 4 weeks.
Then sooner, if you please," said the young lady, turning to Nicholas.
3 or 4 weeks, muttered her father. "Madeline, what on earth? Do nothing for 3 or 4 weeks?"
It is a long time, ma'am," said Nicholas.
"You think it so, do you?" retorted the father angrily. "If I choose to beg, sir, and stoop to ask assistance from people I despise, 3 or 4 months wouldn't be a long time. 3 or 4 years wouldn't be a long time. Understand, sir, that if I choose to be independent, I can be. But as I don't, you may call upon me in a week.
Nicholas bowed low to the young lady and retired, pondering upon Mr. Bray's ideas of independence, and devoutly hoping that there might be few such independent spirits as he mingled with the baser clay of humanity. He heard a light footstep above him as he descended the stairs. Looking round, he saw that the young lady was standing there, and glancing timidly towards him. She seemed to hesitate whether she should call him back or not. The best way of settling the question was to turn back at once, which Nicholas did. I don't know whether I do right in asking you, sir, said Madeline hurriedly, but pray, do not mention to my poor dear mother's friends my father's behaviour today. He has suffered much and is worse in the morning. I beg you, sir, as a boon, a favour to myself, do not say anything about it. You have but to hint a wish, returned Nicholas fervently, and I would hazard my life to gratify it. You speak hastily, sir. Truly and sincerely, rejoined Nicholas, his lips trembling as he formed the words, if ever man spoke truth yet. I am not skilled in disguising my feelings, and if I were, I could not hide my heart from you, dear madam. Dear madam, as I know your history and feel as men and angels must who hear and see such things, I do entreat you to believe that I would die to serve you. The young lady turned her head away and was plainly weeping. Forgive me, said Nicholas with respectful earnestness, if I seem to say too much or presume upon the confidence which has been entrusted to me, but I could not leave you as if my interest and sympathy expired with the commission of the day. I am your faithful servant, humbly devoted to you from this hour, devoted in strict truth and honour to him who sent me here, and in pure integrity of heart and distant respect for you. If I meant more or less than this, I should be unworthy of his regard, and false to the nature that prompts the honest words I utter. She waved her hand, entreating him to be gone, but answered not a word. Nicholas could say no more, and silently withdrew, and thus ended his first interview with Madeline Bray.